Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, Kantians. My name is Andrew Chignell. I'm happy to welcome you to the final edition of the Virtual Kant Congress, which together with Karin de Boer and Z. Kwanbeck and Luis Garcia, I've been helping to curate over the course of this 300th tercentennial year in celebration of Kant's birthday. It's been quite a year. It involved a lot of organization and logistics to coordinate people across many time zones. It's 11 p.m. in Japan right now. It's 3 p.m. in Europe. It's 9 a.m. here on the East Coast. Maybe there are even a few people from California coming in at 6 a.m. for them. Uh, we've had various questions about which groups to include and how to handle geopolitical controversies as they arose. And there was a boycott at some point and a few concerned meetings about how to handle other sorts of protests. We realized that organizing an international event, especially during difficult sort of conflicts across the globe, can sometimes have effects even for scholars. But I think we negotiated through these things in ways that were democratic and effective, collegial in the end, and also respected Kant's cosmopolitan vision. So thank you to Karin de Boer and to Z. Kwanbeck and to Luis Garcia for their incredible work and dedication in behalf of this project, which I think has been a great success. Our last session today is curated, as each of these are, by an individual group or society. In this case, we have left, I don't know if it's the best for last, but it's certainly a very good thing for last. This is the United Kingdom Kant Society. And the curation and panel was and will be performed by Jessica Leach of King's College London. So I will hand it over to Jessica and just say, we welcome people to keep their cameras on if they can. I mean, sometimes people are getting children off to school or preparing dinner or whatever's happening in your time zone, and we understand that. But we welcome people to keep their cameras on. And typically after the talk and panel and discussion, we'll turn off the recording and then leave it open for some informal discussion. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jessica Leach.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to all of the virtual Kant Congress team for putting this together. It's very nice. It kind of feels like a festive atmosphere to come last at the end of this fantastic year. So just one more thing to add, practically speaking, can everybody who isn't Adrian, please check that your microphone is on mute. I know sometimes in talks we get a bit of background noise and it can be quite distracting. So if you can just check that you're on mute unless you're asking a question in the Q&A, that would be really helpful. Thank you. What we decided to do for our contribution to this series is to connect it to our annual Graham Bird lecture. So just a very brief history on what this is. So the UK Kant Society for a long time has had an annual conference, and when the pandemic came, we couldn't have the conference, and we decided to downscale that year to an online lecture. After that, we had some discussions, and we thought it would be a good idea to continue the online lecture series because it was an event that was more accessible to more people who, for whatever reason, aren't able to travel to a conference, spend 2 days, and all that entails. So we've kept the online lecture going, and it was named in the end in memory of Graham Bird, who founded the UK Kant Society in the 1990s. So I'm delighted to welcome Adrian Moore, who is our Graham Bird lecturer this year, and doesn't need that much introduction, I think, to us all. We all I think know him and his work very well. He's a professor at Oxford. So just before I hand over to Adrian, so we're going to have Adrian's talk on Kant on freedom and determinism, and then some Q&A, and as a whole that should take an hour. Then we'll have a short break, and then we'll come back to have a panel discussion on publishing in Kant. So we wanted to extend the event to do something that we hope will be of use and support to postgraduates and early career scholars as well. So Adrian will be speaking on that panel, and also Alix Cohen, and I'll chair that as well. So we'll say more about that panel when it comes, but that's just to kind of give you a heads up what's happening. But yes, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Adrian. Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you, Jess, for the introduction. So before I go any further, a purely practical point, I am going to be reading the text of this talk, and it is available in the chat for anybody that would like to follow it. I know some people find it helpful to follow the text as it's being read. Other people prefer not to. The choice is yours, but it is there available in the chat if you'd like to follow it. So I should like to begin by thanking Jessica for inviting me to give this Graham Bird lecture. It is a great honor to be able to contribute in this way to a remarkable year of celebration of Kant's work. And it also provides me with a wonderful opportunity to honor Graham as well as Kant. And I shall refer very briefly towards the end of this talk to a published disagreement that I had with him, which proved to be enormously thought-provoking for me. I want to deal in this talk with some issues concerning Kant's views about freedom and determinism. And it is, of course, very familiar that one of Kant's greatest reconciling projects, if not the greatest, was his attempt to marry traditional Christian morality with the Newtonian view of the natural world that seemed to have been so well established at the time. And the reason why a reconciling project was required was that Christian morality seemed to make no sense without human freedom, but there seemed to be no room for human freedom in Newton's deterministic world of inexorable mechanical laws governing everything that happens. So the project was, in effect, to show how we could reconcile a commitment to freedom with a commitment to determinism. Let's begin with the commitment to determinism. Kant, without question, had that commitment. And he had it for his own philosophical reasons, as well as for any reasons having specifically to do with Newton. He believed that all changes in nature, including all human actions, occur, as he himself put it, quote, in accordance with the connection of cause and effect, unquote. Now, let's not worry for the time being about the truth of determinism, and let's not worry about its relations to Newton for that matter. The important point in this context is simply that Kant subscribed to it. But Kant also had a commitment to traditional Christian morality. And as part of that commitment, he believed that we human beings are free agents. We make uncoerced decisions about what to do, and we act freely on those decisions. So, in the standard philosophical terminology, Kant seemed to be a classic compatibilist, where compatibilism is the view that determinism of the kind to which he subscribed and freedom of the kind to which he subscribed are entirely compatible with each other. And in a way, Kant was a classic compatibilist. On the other hand, and here we see straight away the difficulties that he was wrestling with, there were places where he explicitly committed himself to an uncompromising incompatibilism. For instance, he famously talked at one point in the Critique of Practical Reason about what he called the wretched subterfuge of the compatibilist project. He specifically had in mind attempts to locate freedom within the natural world of mechanically law-governed events by allowing that an action can be free if some of its causes are internal to the agent. He decried this as no better than attempts to ascribe freedom to, and I quote, a turnspit, which, when once it is wound up, accomplishes its movement of itself, unquote. So, Kant seemed to be both a compatibilist and an incompatibilist. It was as if he wanted to accept a kind of meta-level compatibilism, the compatibilism of ground-level compatibilism and ground-level incompatibilism. Now, there's an old joke that I know that some of you have heard me tell before, but I can't resist telling it again because it nicely illustrates the extraordinary position that Kant found himself in. And the joke goes as follows. Two people are in bitter dispute with each other about whether a proposed course of action is justified or not. And they decide to consult a guru. They explain the situation to the guru. The guru turns to the person who thinks that the proposed course of action is justified and says, "You are right." Then he turns to the person who thinks that the proposed course of action is not justified and says, "You are right." A bystander who's overheard the entire conversation steps in at this point and protests, "But they can't both be right. Their views are incompatible with each other." Turning to the bystander, the guru says, "And you are right as well." So, how did Kant think that he could square this circle? How did he think that he could subscribe both to the ground level compatibilism and to the ground level incompatibilism? Well, he famously tried to square the circle by introducing a sort of relativization. He argued that our commitment to our own freedom and our commitment to determinism are commitments from two different points of view, conceding that they would be incompatible if they were from the same point of view. For a simple analogy, think of the incompatibility of rest and motion. There is a sense, a perfectly straightforward sense, in which rest and motion are incompatible with each other. We can all agree that a physical object which is at rest cannot at the same time be in motion. Nevertheless, a physical object, a luggage rack, for example, can be both at rest relative to a train and at the same time in motion relative to an embankment. And the same sort of relativism, Kant believed, applies in this case. He believed that an event can be both completely determined by antecedent causes when considered from one point of view, and an exercise of freedom when considered from another. And our commitment to our freedom and our commitment to determinism could then be sustained from these two different points of view. Kant's quarrel with the standard compatibilist project was therefore that it espouses a simple absolute compatibilism, whereby even from a single point of view, it can be true both that everything that happens is determined and that some of what happens is a result of free decisions on our part. Kant offered a more oblique, relativistic, meta-level compatibilism. The ground level incompatibilism continues to hold because our two commitments can't be reconciled from any single point of view, but the ground level compatibilism continues to hold too, because it's just as legitimate to adopt one point of view as it is to adopt the other. Ground level compatibilism and ground level incompatibilism are reconciled at the meta level. That was the view. But what was the nature of this relativization? And more to the point, what exactly were the two different points of view that were involved in it? Well, here, of course, Kant's transcendental idealism was pivotal. According to Kant's transcendental idealism, everything that happens in space and time is a matter of how things appear to us, not a matter of how they are in themselves. The underlying reality is neither spatial nor temporal. The 2 points of view are, on the one hand, the point of view of appearances, and on the other hand, the point of view of things in themselves. This is the burden of the third antinomy in his first critique, where he provided reasons for the commitment to freedom and reasons for the commitment to determinism, and then proceeded to explain in just these terms how both commitments could be sustained. Now, Kant took the point of view of things in themselves to have, by its very nature, a kind of priority over the point of view of appearance, albeit he didn't think that we could obtain any substantial theoretical knowledge except of how things are from the latter point of view, the point of view of appearances. Relatedly, and somewhat counterintuitively perhaps, it was the latter point of view, the point of view of appearances, that Kant took to be the point of view afforded by the natural sciences. He believed that from that point of view, the point of view afforded by the natural sciences, everything that we do is determined, but that we human beings are free from the point of view of how things are in themselves. Or in other words, that we human beings are free as we are in ourselves. Since Kant also believed that we can't obtain any substantial theoretical knowledge except of how things are from the point of view of appearances, he was also forced to concede that we can't be said to know that we are free in any substantial theoretical sense. And he readily did concede this. He took our belief that we're free to be at most what he sometimes called an item of practical knowledge, an unavoidable presupposition of our acting at all. And I'll say a little bit more about this later. Now, there are many concerns that we might have about Kant's conception, but here's what I take to be the principal concern, or at least one of the principal concerns. Kant's freedom precluding determinism didn't just leave him with a problem of reconciliation. It left him with a problem about what needs to be reconciled. Which of the various things that we human beings do are to count as exercises of freedom? That's to say, as manifestations of the freedom that we are supposed to enjoy as we are in ourselves. Or equivalently, reverting now to the ulterior reconciling project, which of the various things that we human beings do are apt objects for moral praise or blame? Kant's conception, if it was to serve his purpose at all, or even if it was to have any chance of being taken seriously, also needed to have some chance of connecting with the imputations that we are antecedently inclined to make. But what are the imputations that we are antecedently inclined to make? Admittedly, there are some examples that seem relatively straightforward. If I come down with flu, for example, or if I blink when an object suddenly comes hurtling towards my face, then we're not antecedently inclined to say that I have acted freely. If I deliberate long and hard about whether to tell a lie to a friend, and if, after weighing all the considerations for and against, I decide to tell my friend the truth, then we are antecedently inclined to say that I have acted freely. But if our antecedent inclinations are anything, then they are fluid and revisable. So, for example, suppose we discover that a shoplifter has been acting under hypnosis, or under duress, or under extreme stress, for that matter. Then we will think twice about whether he acted freely, and will think twice about whether it is right to blame him. We'll likewise think twice about whether it is right to blame him if we discover that he is a kleptomaniac. However, and this is the crucial point, what we are antecedently inclined to do, if we become persuaded of determinism and become persuaded of the ground level incompatibilism on which Kant insists, is to give up our own sense of our freedom altogether, to repudiate moral praise and blame altogether. It would be of no avail for Kant to argue that his reconciling project shows that we don't need to do this. the reconciling project comes one consideration too late. It's what we're antecedently inclined to do which dictates what's available to be reconciled. The ground level incompatibilism poses an insuperable problem here then. If we can be persuaded of such incompatibilism and of the determinism to which Kant was committed, then we will be antecedently inclined to say that none of what we do is free. Now, at this point, it is tempting to invoke what is, superficially at least, an attractive way of defending Kant against this objection, where by attractive I mean both philosophically attractive, having some plausibility in its own right, and exegetically attractive, having some claim to being what Kant meant all along. And I have in mind the view that it was inappropriate ever to talk about ground level incompatibilism. What was at stake was rather what we might call ground level incommensurability. So the idea is that instead of talking about the incompatibility of freedom and determinism, we should have been talking about the incompatibility of exercise of the concept of freedom and exercise of the concept of determinism. So to make sense of things as completely determined by antecedent causes is to leave freedom out of the picture, neither accommodating it nor precluding it. This makes the relationship between freedom and determinism no more straightforwardly incompatibilist than it is straightforwardly compatibilist. It's not that there's some conceptual rule that precludes describing one and the same event as completely determined by antecedent causes and as an exercise of freedom. It's rather that the conceptual rules that govern the description of an event as one of these do not govern the description of it as the other at all. If someone asserts of some given action that it was completely determined by antecedent causes, then they are not thereby committed to denying that it was an exercise of freedom as well. Rather, they put the question of whether it was an exercise of freedom to one side. It simply does not arise, at least while what is at issue is whether they are correct in their original assertion. There is an analogy that I think helps to illustrate this. Consider the two following claims that someone might make in the course of a board game. Claim number one: the next move in this game can't be a pawn move, because if white moves any of her pawns, she will place herself in check. Claim number two: the next move in this game can't be a pawn move because it's a game of drafts. The can't in the first of these, which alludes to the impossibility of placing oneself in check in a game of chess, can be thought of as the Kant of incompatibility. The Kant in the second of these, which alludes to the impossibility of making a pawn move in a game of drafts, can be thought of as the Kant of incommensurability. Now, there are passages in which it looks as though Kant was indeed concerned with just such incommensurability. In the first critique, for instance, he wrote, and I quote, "It is impossible that something in nature ought to be other than what it in fact is. Indeed, the ought, if one has merely the course of nature before one's eyes, has no significance whatsoever. We cannot ask at all what ought to happen in nature any more than we can ask what properties a circle ought to have." Unquote. Given the close connection between claims about what ought to happen and claims about freedom, this can readily be heard as a commitment to just the kind of incommensurability with which we have been concerned. And given the philosophical attractions of that commitment, a principle of charity may seem to provide an overwhelming case for attributing it to Kant. But there is just too much, in my view, that makes attribution to him of ordinary ground level incompatibilism much more compelling from an exegetical point of view. To take just one example of many, in the second critique, he wrote that, and again I quote, "If one takes the determinations of the existence of things in time for determinations of things in themselves, then the necessity and the causal relation can in no way be united with freedom. Instead, they are opposed to one another as contradictory." Unquote. I don't myself believe then that this way of escaping the quandary, however philosophically attractive it would have been, was Kant's own, and the quandary therefore remained for him. Now, we might wonder why Kant didn't just surrender his own conviction that any of what we do is free. Well, there were many reasons. For one thing, as I have already indicated, he thought that we can't help regarding some of what we do as free. We can't help regarding ourselves as free agents. There is a well-known quotation from his groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, in which he captured this idea as follows, quote, "The will of a rational being cannot be a will of his except under the idea of freedom," unquote. But how secure a basis was this on which to proceed? Not very, we might think. Indeed, elsewhere in Kant's own work, he provided us with plenty of examples of things that we can't help accepting, at least provisionally, even though they can eventually be shown to be untenable. Things that we can't help accepting until we ultimately manage to convince ourselves that they are subject to mere, albeit powerful, illusions. One example being that the physical universe exists as a unified whole. It would have been very natural for Kant to dismiss our belief in our own freedom as yet another illusion. But Kant would never have done that. And this in turn was for the very deep reason to which I have already adverted. It would, he thought, have meant sacrificing all those fundamental ethical ideas as well. The difference between moral praise and blame, the difference between right and wrong. And that for Kant would have been an unacceptably high price to pay. I have argued that Kant faced an insurmountable problem because his ground level incompatibilism left him unable to give a satisfactory account of what he was trying to reconcile with what. There are also, of course, grounds for doubting whether the transcendental idealism to which he subscribed, and with it the fundamental distinction that he drew between how things appear and how they are in themselves, was capable of withstanding ultimate scrutiny. Although I'll say no more about that now because of what a huge issue it so obviously is. Instead, I want to close by suggesting a third difficulty that Kant may have faced, connected with his third antinomy. I said earlier that what Kant did in the third antinomy was to provide reasons for his commitment to freedom and reasons for his commitment to determinism, and then to explain how both commitments could be sustained. Both commitments could be sustained in Kant's view because of the meta-level compatibilism. This kept alive the possibility that there are genuine exercises of freedom, despite the fact that everything that happens in nature is completely determined by antecedent causes. Although, as I also pointed out, it was Kant's conviction that we can't be said to know in any suitably substantial theoretical sense that there are genuine exercises of freedom. Now, the difficulty that I have in mind bears on how exactly this relates to what Kant took himself to have achieved in the third antinomy. One of the things that he did in the third antinomy, to repeat, was to provide reasons for his commitment to freedom. And this he did in the argument for the thesis of the antinomy, which he expressed as follows, and I quote, "Causality in accordance with laws of nature is not the only one from which all the appearances of the world can be derived. It is also necessary to assume another causality through freedom in order to explain them." Unquote. Now, admittedly, this was an argument that Kant ultimately rejected. The whole point of this part of the critique of pure reason was to discredit arguments that appear compelling but that must ultimately be rejected. But the question arises, what part of this argument did Kant reject? Or equivalently, what survived of this argument once its critical error had been exposed? My own view is that Kant took the critical error not only in the third antinomy, but in the other three antinomies as well, to be a kind of conflation of appearances with things in themselves. But that he was prepared to subscribe to everything else in their respective arguments. And this, incidentally, is part of the controversy between Graham and me, to which I referred at the beginning. We had a disagreement about this with specific reference to the first antinomy rather than the third. And I'll be very happy to come back to this in the discussion if people would like me to. But if I'm right about this, then it looks as though Kant was, after all, prepared to grant us substantial knowledge of a sort, substantial theoretical knowledge of a sort, concerning the existence of freedom at the level of things in themselves. And indeed, he did write, and this is another quotation, "We have established the necessity of a first beginning of a series of appearances from freedom, only to the extent that this is required to make comprehensible an origin of." But because the faculty of beginning a series in time is thereby proved, now we are permitted also to ascribe to the substances in different series in the course of the world the faculty of acting from freedom, unquote. Part of what Kant took the argument for the thesis of the third antinomy to show, it seems to me, is that there must be something that lacks any external cause and that grounds whatever happens in the world of space and time. And as the quotation that I have just given testifies, he was prepared to go further and to talk in terms of freedom. The difficulty that he may have faced was how to reconcile this with his repeated insistence that we could have no substantial theoretical knowledge of the existence of freedom. I have dwelt in this talk on difficulties that I take Kant to have faced. Which of us hasn't dwelt at one time or another on difficulties that we take Kant to have faced? None of us needs reminding that this is perfectly consistent with taking him to have been a great philosopher. My own view is that he was the greatest ever. And I thank you once again for the honor of being able to make this contribution to his tercentenary year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adrian. That was great. So we've got some time for questions. We started a bit late, so I'll allow this to nibble a bit, kind of push our break a little bit back and nibble a bit out of the panel time, but I think that should be Okay, so if you have a question, please use the raise hand function. You can find it under React. Click on React and it opens up a panel and you can click on raise hand. So please do it that way. And we'll go to Alvaro first, please.
Yes, thank you, Jess, and thanks so much, Adrian, for the wonderful presentation. And as always, so I'm very sympathetic towards the reading that you provide and the problems that you see in Kant's theory. I'm completely with you that there's something going on with what sorts of imputations we are allowed or entitled to make that Kant is never too clear about. But I had a bit of a concern with the specific argument that you make about how incompatibilism would lead us to reject or discard our intuitions about blame and praise, and that, well, commitment to ground level incompatibilism, right, doesn't immediately entail a rejection of praise and blame. It entails a rejection of the conjunct of our intuitions about praise and blame and the truth of determinism. And so it is true, of course, that Kant was very much committed to determinism, but one could ask, when confronted with ground level incompatibilism, why is it more natural in that way for us to go on and reject those key aspects of our practical cognition and of practical reason, rather than go and reject those principles that are equally as key, right, but for theoretical reason? That maybe one could be concerned that you're assuming a sort of primacy of the theoretical in saying that when confronted with incompatibilism, we would go on and jettison praise and blame, whereas Kant would say, well, no, right? The practical has the primacy here, and if something goes, it is going to be the theoretical. Of course, he doesn't want to say that either, right? But yeah, well, what do you think about this?
Well, I think that's a perfectly fair question, and indeed, that's part of the reason why I put things in the way that I did. So the suggestion was that if we have certain antecedent commitments, then there's going to be an issue about what we're trying to reconcile with what. And I deliberately characterized those antecedent commitments as commitments not just to incompatibilism, ground level incompatibilism, but to ground level incompatibilism and determinism. So you're quite right that unless we've got the commitment to determinism as well, then the problem doesn't arise in this form. So I entirely agree with you about that. And therefore the question does arise, suppose that all that we were absolutely wedded to was the incompatibilism, why not give up determinism instead? And it's a fair question, but as far as exegesis of Kant himself is concerned, I guess the point to note, or one point to note, is what a colossal sacrifice that would have been. I mean, he's got to go back and rewrite the second analogy at this point, and I mean, there's a lot going on. I mean, there's a lot going on in Kant's philosophy. Never mind what pressure he might have felt under as a result of Newtonian science, for example. As I say, I'm basically on board with the point that you make, and you're right that there are places where Kant explicitly makes a deal out of the fact that the practical enjoys a kind of priority over the theoretical, you might think, well, that's surely relevant at this point as well. But as I say, I think the point to note from the purely exegetical point of view is just how much he would have had to give up if he had surrendered his determinism.
Thank you. So just to say, I've got a queue growing, so I'm going to ask everybody to be I mean, that was quite a concise exchange, but to keep your questions concise and answers concise so we can hear from as many people as possible. Leslie, I saw your hand go up and then it went down again. Do you have a question?
2 points you did not consider. Firstly, whether determinism is true. Modern physics is not deterministic, and it's not obvious that that doesn't leak out into animal behavior, for example. Secondly, was Kant, did he need to be committed to it? Do the arguments in the second analogy really support complete determinism, or just that there's a lot of deterministic causation around?
I think I can be brief in response to that two-part question. Because first of all, I can straightforwardly acknowledge that I haven't myself said anything about whether determinism is true. So this was, as far as that goes, this was a purely exegetical exercise rather than a philosophical exercise. But the second question that you raised was an exegetical question. To what extent is Kant committed to determinism himself? Partly an exegetical question, partly a philosophical question. There's the issue of how successful we think the arguments in the second analogy or in the third antinomy, for that matter, are successful. And that's a philosophical issue. How do we assess those arguments? The crucial exegetical point is that whether those arguments are successful or not, he thought they were, and he thought that they yielded determinism, it seems to me. There may be room for dispute about what he thought they established, but I would myself have thought that he took them to establish determinism.
Andrew.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Adrian, for a great talk and a fitting tribute to Graham Bird. My question was just about the I suppose your point about when the reconciling project comes in. So it sounded like you say we are antecedently inclined to one thing or the other, either to freedom or to incompatibilism plus determinism. And then you say, but these these antecedent imputations are fluid and revisable. And I would have thought that Kant's reconciling project is sort of responding to that. That we've got these antecedent inclinations, but then we do some philosophy and we try to reconcile it. Then you go on to say, the reconciling project comes one consideration too late. It's as though these antecedent inclinations dictate what is available to be reconciled. So are they fluid and revisable in response to philosophical reconciling projects, or are they really just stuck and the philosophy is not going to help?
No, I think that's an excellent question. And I do take them to be fluid and revisable, even in the light of philosophical considerations. And indeed, the thought that maybe nothing that we do is free would be a response in part to philosophical considerations. I mean, my thought was that's what you're going to end up thinking if you become persuaded of determinism and ground level incompatibilism. But then you're raising the very good question, yeah, but what if you become persuaded of meta level compatibilism? Aren't we now back to square one again with the possibility of reconciliation? But I do think, so this is a structural issue as much as anything else. I do think that my worry survives, because the worry is not whether the reconciling project is successful or not. The worry is what's being reconciled, which of the many things that happen in the natural world are going to be candidates for ascriptions of praise and blame, for example. Which of the various things that go on are we going to want to continue to count as exercises of freedom? And the meta-level reconciling project has come one consideration too late, because it's now no longer clear what's there to be salvaged. The ground level incompatibilism has wiped everything out. That was the thought. So as I say, it's a structural thought as much as anything.
So by the time you get to the meta question, you've just lost any inclination to perform the reconciliation, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, any inclination is putting it a bit too strongly, I guess. I mean, it's going to be a little bit like what's going on in the antinomies. However carefully you scrutinize these arguments, there's still going to be an impulse to think one thing or the other that there was originally. But so but something along those lines, that when you're properly carefully thinking it through, you'll have lost the inclination to think that there's anything there to be salvaged any longer. That was the thought. Yeah.
Thank you.
Kepler.
Thank you for this analysis of Kant's commitments to freedom and determinism. I'm wondering to what extent this applies only to human beings in the Kantian framework, or if any of these ideas could also be applied to nature and even to the universe more broadly. I'm thinking about Kant's pre-critical philosophy, and especially his writings on astronomy, where he suggests that the planets themselves have some freedom in the positions and the orbits because God wanted to give the planets that kind of autonomy. So I'm curious how we could maybe extend or not any of these concepts to this broader idea of natural laws and the cosmos.
That's a really interesting point. I hadn't thought about these issues in connection with those pre-critical writings. I mean, I'm sure that by the time he's writing the first critique, planets are out of the picture, partly because of the very intimate connection that he sees between freedom and rationality. And so, it's not just planets, but cats and dogs are out of the picture as well, presumably. But there's another reason why your question is a really interesting question, I think, because it does force us back to the third antinomy and to the question of just what exactly is going on there in the thesis. That's a massive issue in its own right. I mean, I said towards the end of my talk that I thought there was a kind of commitment to freedom in the thesis of the third antinomy, but it's not clearly the same as what we've been talking about. The suggestion is not that we can see exercises of freedom in some of the individual actions that people perform. There's almost a suggestion that there's a kind of freedom that's underpinning the universe as a whole, and that was one reason that I thought your question was interesting, because it sort of connects with that. I don't have much to say, certainly in the short time available, that is very helpful as far as that's concerned, I'm afraid, other than to register that there are these very interesting issues in the background.
Thank you.
Konstantinos.
Yeah. Thanks. I have a question about the meta-compatibilist thesis. Where exactly does Kant talk about it? Or doesn't he talk? He doesn't talk about it. And what about the infinite regress problem that it's created? Because then you might say, okay, what about the compatibility between the meta-compatibilism and the meta-incompatible thesis? So what would Kant say about that?
I mean, as regards where Kant discusses this, I should emphasize, I mean, perhaps this is stating the obvious, but I'll say it anyway. This is my terminology, not Kant's. I mean, the terminology is not there in Kant. But I think a discussion of the issues is there in Kant. And I guess one of the first places that one would want to point to is the third antinomy, which is one of the things that I've been discussing. And I take it that what you find in discussion of the third antinomy is a kind of defense of this meta-level compatibilism. You raised the question, why doesn't this launch us off onto an infinite regress? Do we now need a meta-level stance to reconcile meta-level compatibilism with meta-level incompatibilism? But I don't think that Kant would have been worried about that, because I don't think Kant would have thought that there was a meta-level incompatibilism to be reconciled. So you step up a level and you've got the reconciliation that you need, and then you don't need to step up again. I mean, apologies if I'm misinterpreting your question, but I take it that that's what you were asking, why aren't we forced up to a yet higher level? And I don't think that Kant thinks that we would need to be.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry. TK Chu.
Well, thank you. My question is related to the question asked by speaker two speakers ago by Dr. Babiak, but I'll phrase differently. In the beginning, you said that Newtonian physics is mechanical, it's determinism. And middle in the talk, you refer, there's no sense in asking the question ought in motion. Now, but we do not know what makes Newtonian law, or Kant didn't say. So if we do not know anything what makes Newtonian's law, how can we say that there's no sense in asking ought in motion? Is my clear?
I'm not entirely sure that I get the question, I'm afraid. Would it be possible for you to rephrase it?
Okay. First, you said Newtonian laws is mechanical in the beginning. That gives us the determinism.
Yeah.
Then in the middle of the talk, you said there's no sense in asking what is ought, A-O-U-G-H-T, in motion.
Yeah.
Now, so the question is, if we do not know what makes Newtonian law, what determines Newtonian law? How can we say that the ought has no meaning?
Okay, good, thanks. I get it. I mean, I suppose there is an issue. I mean, suppose you thought that something that maybe Kant himself thought, which is that the reason why the Newtonian laws of nature are as they are is ultimately as a result of God's exercise of will, then there would be a question whether they ought to be that way. And presumably, if it's down to God, then the answer is going to be, well, they are the way that they ought to be. I mean, if that's what you're getting at, then I take the point. I think that Kant's own view would have been that even so, there is an important sense in which the ought doesn't get a grip within nature, that, as it were, once those laws have been laid down, once we've got the decrees, the natural decrees that govern how things work in the natural world, then we can't look at some natural phenomenon and say, well, ought that perhaps to have been different, or ought that perhaps to have happened differently? The question just doesn't arise within the framework of the natural world. But if you're saying, yeah, but the question does arise whether the natural world as a whole is the way that it ought to be, you know, perhaps there is a legitimate worry there. Yeah.
So with apologies to Mattis and Wolfgang, I'm afraid we're out of time for questions. I think we managed to fit quite a lot in though, so I'm well done, everyone. I'm just going to wrap up this part of the session just by saying three things quickly. So the first is we will take, in a few moments, we'll take a short break so people can stretch their legs, get something to drink, so on. But we'll start the next part of the session, the panel discussion on publishing Kant, promptly at 20 past, whatever your hour is. The second thing is that I'll hand over to Daniel in a second. He wanted just to say something brief to wrap up this part of the session. But before I hand over to Daniel, first, I'd just like to invite everybody to warmly thank Adrian again for a really interesting talk and a great discussion. So thank you, Adrian.
Thank you.
And Daniel, if you want to wrap up this part, and then we'll take our break. You're muted. You're still muted. Sorry.
There we go. Thanks very much. I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank again Karin de Boer, but also Andrew for spearheading the organization of the Virtual Kant Congress. And this has been a terrific session to end on. It's been a very successful series. And I also want to thank again Luis Philippe and Z for their organizational work. There's a lot of work that went behind this. I think this has been a wonderful way to celebrate Kant's 300th birthday. And I won't say more than that, but thank you again, Karin, Andrew, Luis Philippe, and Z for all that you've done to make this a very successful series.
Thank you, Daniel. So I'll see everybody at 20 past.
I think Karin wanted to say one thing by way of signing up.
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Andrew. Yes, I wanted to look back at the 24 sessions that we had this year. And I wanted to just to share my joy about the fact that we were able to put together this virtual Kant Congress together with Andrew, Luis, and Z. And I also wanted to mention that even Kant's anniversary comes to an end, but I also wanted to look at the future and to share with you the idea that that the effects of the virtual Kant Congress will continue. Yeah, so they will trickle down, and we have also seen and felt how new contacts were established over the sessions, and how participants returned and got to know each other. And I'm sure that many of us were inspired by these sessions and all the ideas that were put forward. And I also wanted to mention that new Kant groups emerged from the preparation for the virtual Kant sessions. So I think that's really remarkable and something to be very happy about. I also wanted to mention that that I felt engaging with the virtual Kant Congress, that somehow we were able to engage in something like transcendence. Yes, maybe some of you won't like the term, but I think that it is useful or appropriate to think about what we did in terms of a certain transcendence. because we transcended national borders, time zones, but also intellectual and social conventions and backgrounds. And I think, again, I think this is something remarkable, yes. And I hope that that we'll be able to go beyond this 1 year of celebrations and to continue to connect with other scholars worldwide in the spirit of the VKC, but also in the spirit, I think, of Kant's own cosmopolitanism, even though, as we know, he never left Königsberg. So thank you for having joined us on this adventure. And I hope that that all of us will also be able to continue the dialogue in other contexts. And I think I can say this on behalf of my co-organizers as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, I think that so normally we do an informal part, but I think that Z is going to switch off the recording.